Good morning, it's Ian Whitworth from Scene Change. Welcome to Saxton Scene Change Fireside Chats. Our guest today is a celebrated Australian adventurer and author. He's done some iconic journeys, which obviously we'll discuss today. He's known as much for that as a champion of resilience, of developing cultural understanding with different people, and generally getting outside your comfort zone. From that, he's earned the unique title from National Geographic magazine of Cultural Ambassador. Rather than me tell you, let's watch a video of what Tim's been up to.
When I was 20 years old, my friend Chris and I were cycling across Mongolia. While struggling through the Gobi Desert one day, these amazing wild horsemen came galloping from over the horizon. They headed off to places that our bikes could never have gone. These people had a world without boundaries. From here in Mongolia stretched the great Eurasian steppe to Hungary, and their ancestors were once warriors who crossed this vast space. It inspired in me a dream to live the life of a nomad and ride a horse from Mongolia to the Danube. I never imagined what lay before me. Long nights alone menaced by wolves and thieves, impossible mountain passes, and the most extreme climate on Earth. But I was driven on by an old nomad wisdom. To understand the wolf, you must put on the skin of a wolf and see through its eyes.
Tim Cope, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning, Ian.
That is some terrifying stuff. Is it true that you thought, I'll just retrace the steps of Genghis Khan, yet you had not technically ridden a horse at that point?
That's true.
I didn't know how to ride a horse.
That's true. When I was in Mongolia at that time on the bicycles you just saw in the video, I was just completely taken aback by these nomadic people who came galloping out of nowhere. They'd come up to us on the bicycle and usually out of their pocket in their great big cloaks called a del, hand us over a bit of dried curd known as arl, and then leave us in the dust, galloping off to wherever they wanted. And I really wanted to understand what it was like to have their freedom, to live in a world where there were no fences and live that nomadic life in sync with the seasons rather than the 9 to 5. And by the time I got home, I realised the only way that I could see how to do that was to get on a horse and ride from Mongolia right across what's called the Eurasian steppes to Hungary. But I could not ride a horse. I was terrified of them. I'd been bucked off when I was 7 years old, broke my arm and never been back on.
How long from that idea was it till you were actually on a horse?
It was a couple of...
starting that adventure.
It was a couple of years. I turned up, I had spent about 5 days on a horse in Australia preparing. I'd done a lot of research, but I decided that who better to learn from than the nomadic people of the steppe who were the first to domesticate the horse and 5,000 or 6,000 years ago and have been living with them ever since. Of course, it was not smooth sailing from day one. In fact, I was too terrified to get on the horse on day one, and there was a big group that had gathered to watch this stranger set off on the trail of their ancient hero, Genghis Khan. But I had to walk the horse out of the village. I was too scared to get on.
These things are so much worse when people are actually looking at you.
Absolutely.
And so how far into the trip did you get before, say, your horses got stolen?
Well, day 5, I went to sleep in this beautiful environment. It was like an ocean of green grass, people bringing their animals in to milk, kids galloping around. I felt like I'd landed in my kind of childhood dream. But I went to sleep, woke up with the earth vibrating under me and the sound of horses galloping off. And there was a faint snigger as well. I leapt out and sure enough, 2 of my 3 horses had been stolen. I did what any adventurer would do in the modern world in this scenario. I just got my satellite phone out and called a friend for advice. And she said, well, you better get going before sunrise or you'll never solve your problem. And I was very fortunate that a couple of hours later I came across a herd and there were my horses. A guy came up to me, returned the horses, introduced me to his family. We had a great big meal. And he told me a saying that I was able to later translate, and it transformed my journey and was the first big lesson. They say in Mongolian that a person on the steppe without friends is as narrow as a finger. The steppe being this 6,000 miles of open desert plains and mountains, and a person on the steppe with friends is as wide as the steppe. So I had to go out there and make friends with the unfamiliar, and get to know this very different culture. And if I had become upset every time someone tried to steal a horse from me on this trip, it would have been a miserable experience. And that was kind of came back to me later when I was told a saying that you should always be more curious and less offended when you're faced with something that you don't understand, that's difficult. And sure enough, I mean, horse stealing was kind of part and parcel of life out there, and I had to embrace it as a compliment, really. I had horses that were worth treasuring and worth protecting.
So when you have your horses repeatedly stolen, if that's kind of the way they hello there, what do they actually say when you come up and just go, excuse me, you have my horse? What do they say?
Well, there was another occasion when my horse was stolen. I managed to get it back with the help of others. In the morning, I had a chat to the guy and he said, well, look, well done according to custom. You have managed to steal your horse back. He shook my hand and we said goodbye. And that was the fine line I often rode on this journey between friend and foe, and it can be one and the same, of course. Overwhelmingly, of course, the people were just incredibly hospitable. They took me in like I was a part of the family. And one of the things I treasure from this experience was that I was constantly feeling vulnerable and forced to make friends with people who were totally different to me, people who had no obligation to help me, and yet seemed to go out of their way to look after me. And I felt often they felt sorry for me, but also they could see that I was emanating part of their culture. The way I often talk about it is, if you were to be on the middle of the ocean in a little boat, you wouldn't pass up the opportunity to say hello to someone else you might happen to bump into. And there was an incredible sense of friendship and solidarity that could be built over a cup of tea, a day of feasting, or even longer, as it turned out on some occasions.
Do you think we're too suspicious and standoffish in Western culture? Standoffish?
Well, I think there is a high degree of focus in our society of being self-reliant and being a master of all things, which I think is it's a little bit of a misconception, because it does take a village to raise a person. And for me, the most valuable part of this trip is to meet people who challenge my views, who turn assumptions on their head. And I think when you live in a world where there's a focus on independence, we miss out on that opportunity, to learn about cultures and points of view that are very different. It can make us more insular, despite living in a kind of digital, globalized world.
And did you get any meaningful gifts on your travels?
Well, there were many gifts, but I'll tell you about this in a moment. But it wouldn't be right to call it a gift. But there was a moment in Kazakhstan when I've been traveling with a man called Asset for a couple of weeks. We'd been through our first couple of blizzards, and he turned to me and said, "Tim, you need a friend on this long road, someone to keep you warm at night in the tent and protect you from the wolves." And that's when he gave me this tiny little pup. His name was Tigon. He looked a little bit like a bag of ribs on matchstick legs. And I took one look and thought, this guy is not going to have any chance of surviving more than a couple of weeks. Keeping in mind, we were heading into the coldest winter in 40 years, where it would drop to minus 52 degrees Celsius. But Asset looked me squarely in the eye and said, Tim, in our culture, dogs choose their humans. He's yours. And what's more, we cannot give dogs as gifts. You have to provide something reciprocal in return. And as it turned out, this little pup had been loved by his own son, a little boy who had cerebral palsy, who I'd met before the start of the trip. And so I gave him a gift, a little baby kangaroo and some other mementos from Australia. And I've always thought that Tigon kind of carries the spirit of this man and his son. And from day one after that, I couldn't live without this little guy. And clearly this man Asset could foresee a lot more than I could.
Do we have any footage of Tigon there?
Tigon, come on. Come on, mate. Hey, no. Tigon, no. What?
Great dog. Fit looking dog too. That looks like a dog to go exploring with.
Yeah,
Did he come back with you?
Well, at that stage, he was 6 months old, so he was having the first winter of his life. He used to sometimes jump up on my back just to get his paws out of the cold. But I learned a little trick of how to paint vodka on his paws to prevent the frostbite. And I used to also lock him inside a great big sports bag when I first set up my camp in the winter evenings. And he would curl up in a ball, stay warm. But when the dinner began to boil, this bag would come back to life and start hopping towards the petrol stove. And that was when I'd share a little treat. But to cut a long story short, he grew into a great big, brave dog who led the way. He did protect me. He did keep me company. He found me friends. He was out the front, meeting the people. And after a year of him being in various quarantines, I did manage to get him back to Australia.
Beautiful. That's a great looking dog. Tim, you speak of the importance of learning to rush slowly. Tell us more about that.
Well, there's a special saying, and I'll come to that in a moment, but where it really came down hard on me was in a place called the starving steppe of Kazakhstan. I'd been riding right through into the middle of winter. It was minus 40 degrees. My tent was falling apart. One of the horses had an abscess, and it was 2 days to Christmas. So I pulled the map out and thought, I've got to get out of here and seek refuge. There was a dot on the map. I went for it. I pushed really hard into the night for a couple of days and eventually arrived in this gold mining town called Akbakai. I was led into a little mud hut by a couple of men whose names were Grisha and Victor. I was warm. I wasn't alone, but in the morning I woke up and my predicament began to become pretty obvious. They were two men who'd lost their truck driving licenses a few years earlier, and they'd been here ever since, scrapping a living. The town was kind of bankrupt. People were really just clinging on. Most of them were involved in contraband gold mining. I called home on the satellite phone to my family, my three siblings and my parents. It was 26 degrees of sunshine. People were probably flicking between the Sydney to Hobart and the Boxing Day test at that stage. And I was chewing on a bit of pigeon bone. These guys had caught a couple of pigeons on the street. And I wanted out of there just for a day or two to be around friends and family, but it wasn't to be. I tried to leave this town 5 or 6 times, but at every move I was thwarted. I got sick, and eventually Tigon was stolen by some unemployed mine workers. He was rescued, but time and time again, these men and someone else I've been sat me down and said, Tim, what are you doing? Every time you get out here, you're rushing, you're just cursing yourself. In our culture, rushing is sacrilege. We have a saying, if you must rush in life, rush slowly. And that's where I was forced to kind of recognise that my approach wasn't working. I sat back, also began to reflect that this is a world where time wasn't measured in the 9 to 5. It was more about accepting the seasons, the fact that sometimes the conditions mean that you can't move, and life out here is a bit like threading a needle every single day. And it allowed me to re-begin or restart the journey with a very different approach. And I feel like there were two journeys. There was a journey up until Akbakai, and there was a journey from here onwards when I just had to accept that the journey would take as long as it needed to. Much like these COVID times, to be honest, where we're stuck in a certain reality, and we know it will pass. We don't know what the other end looks like, but having that patience, I'm finding myself going through the same motion, albeit stuck in Melbourne and not Akbakai.
People kind of go, well, you're clearly a super achiever with tremendous reserves of patience and tenacity. What sort of lessons can people who have lots of deadlines and a lot going on and they're stressed and freaking out and bored at the same time, how do we adapt to that mindset that you had to everyday life in Australia?
Well, I think that you really need to find time in every single day to unplug, to leave the phone behind, to go for a walk, and don't leave the ear pods at home. Just actually let your create a little bit of space for things to digest, to reflect, and find a little bit of calm in the storm. I was told that long before my trip began, that particularly when you're living with 3 horses and a dog, if you get stressed, if you lose your calm, then what hope of the people, the animals, in my case, around you, what hope have they got of getting through? So I often go back to that saying. But more than that, when things got really tough on my trip, one thing that gave me inspiration was just looking around at the people, listening to their stories, getting a bit of context and perspective. I felt that I'd put myself in a very difficult position. I'd chosen to be there in many ways. These people were born into a life that was infinitely greater. And so I constantly draw on inspiration from that in my life today, whether it be reading stories about people who are in much more difficult circumstances, people who are close or far. And just the resilience, yeah.
Yeah. So what are your resilience tips? Because resilience is such a cliche since this whole COVID thing started. It's like, be resilient. What are your tips?
Well, I definitely suggest that, speaking from my personal experience, find a little bit of time for physical exercise in every day. It is to keep an eye on the big picture. Don't get lost in the small stuff. But on the other hand, one thing I found during the trip, and I try to relate this to my life now, sometimes you better not look at the big picture because it can be overwhelming. I kept that great big map of Eurasia safely hidden at the bottom of my boxes sometimes, because to pull it out and recognise I was making it millimetre at a time per day was overwhelming. So I had to focus on getting through to lunch. And if I got through to lunch okay, I'd reward myself and get through to dinner, wake up and do the same thing. So it can be that method of oscillating between achieving small goals and then zooming back out and looking at the bigger picture. Both of those methods have their place, and I constantly do. And I've learned that in my writing as well. and everything all the creative things I've done. Sometimes you've got to zoom in, you get really deep into the detail, and then you've got to zoom out and detach yourself a little bit and float over the terrain and not get too emotionally involved.
Good advice. So then, after the steppes, you then had to take on the Kazakh desert. How was that?
Well, during the winter, I had craved the sun like nothing else, but you have to be careful what you wish for, because in the summers in central Kazakhstan, they normally have at least 40 days in a row of 40 degrees Celsius. And I found that by 9 o'clock in the morning, it was unbearable. So I had to start riding exclusively at night. And I began to live in fear of this great big fireball that would come up over the horizon. And once again, it was the people who came to my rescue. I would hopefully find somewhere to shelter before sunrise. And usually the people out there, they live in underground huts during the day, and they do all their work at dusk and dawn and sleep on the earth at night. They say first time as a guest, you're a friend. Second time, you're part of the family. Third time as a guest among Kazakhs, you can stay for life. And that's a genuine way that I felt I was treated. And if I could just quickly mention a saying that wouldn't have meant much to me before I started. The Kazakhs believe that mountains never meet, people do. And there's something about being isolated that on one hand enables you to feel vulnerable, recognise where you perhaps need to grow as a leader of yourself, to feel comfortable in your own isolation, but also you appreciate just how important human relationships are, whether that be friends or family or making new connections. And that's something that nomads who live in a naturally environment that's inhospitable and often they're dealing with adverse conditions. It's something that there's not a day that goes by when they don't recognise that.
And so you finally crossed the Carpathians. We saw some footage before of you sliding up and down hills with horses, which looked pretty hairy. How was it to finally get there and just go, wow, I did it?
I've been living in fear of these great big mountains, the Carpathians, since the beginning, because it was the type of place where one misstep and we'd probably roll down the ice and snow and the journey would be all over in a moment. But what I found was that the journey, by that stage, I'd been on the road for 3 years. It equipped me with more than enough confidence, skill. I'd set off as someone who couldn't ride a horse, and now the animals almost felt like an extension of my own body. And we just crossed over these mountains with a sense of pleasure and ease. It may look difficult, but to me it was just a wonderful high note to end the journey on. From the top of those mountains, Tigon and I looked down to the Hungarian plains, and kind of like in a dream, not long after that, we crossed the border and reached the finish line. Of course, by that stage, as you might be able to see, Tigon was definitely much more than the passenger. He was breaking out of the tent first thing in the morning. And I guess if there was one other lesson that I draw from that, it's simply that I've taken this philosophy now that I'm not going to let those things that I think might make me fail, stop me from doing things, because ultimately when you reach them, they end up being nothing more than a pebble in the road, or just a pleasure really, because you've been given and all of the skills along the way. You've been forced to rise to the occasion through all those unexpected challenges. Yeah.
It's fantastic. And tell us about you got some bad news when you emerged at the end of the trip.
Yeah, the trip, having just said that, the trip prepared me for most of the challenges, bar one. And that was about 6 months from the finish line. I was riding along, I got a satellite phone message to call home, and I discovered that my father, Andrew, had been in a car accident back here in Victoria in Australia, and he'd passed away instantly. The journey suddenly kind of vanished before my eyes. I found a farm to leave my horses at, to leave Tigon at. I came straight back to Australia, and for 4 or 5 months, all I could cope with was the death of my dad, and it was definitely the biggest event in my life and in the life of my siblings. And it felt as if life had kind of been broken in two at that stage. Life before that, with a father, and then moving forward, life without. And I remember when I did make the decision to go back and do those last 1,000 or 2,000 kilometres on the horses, it was the easiest part of the trip, really. Gone with the thieves, gone with the wolves, gone with the winters and the deserts. But life felt unbelievably fragile. And at every turn, it was hard not to think about how fortunate we are if we do survive into old age. I mean, my dad was 56. I met an old lady there in Western Ukraine, stayed with her. She was about 90. She learned to read at the age of 80. She lived through World War II. She'd lived through what's called Golodomir, the famine in Ukraine during Stalin's years in the early 30s. She'd lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union and so much else. And he was my dad, who passed away in a car accident in a very safe world, safe environment, really. And it made me reflect on many, many things. Yeah, but a very sad time. But I was looking forward more than anything else to coming back to Australia and spending time with friends and family when I did finish the trip.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it must have been like to get that news when you're on the other side of the world in that situation. When you finished the trip, is there something you sort of thought, damn, I wish I could have told Dad that you'd learned on the trip?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I got an email from my father a couple of weeks before he passed away. And it was a beautiful email where he exposed some of his vulnerabilities, some of his emotions. As someone who just retired, was a bit uncertain, he'd taken early retirement, he was uncertain about his future. And to this day, I regret not writing back to him and saying, you know, I feel really sorry for you, Dad. I love you. I'm really grateful for the childhood that I've had, and thank you for all your support. When I got back home, all 4 of us kids had received that email, and there were the first thing we asked each other when we met. One of the first things was, "Did you reply to that email?" What an amazing opportunity to connect to Dad on that level, and fortunately, I believe it was my brother Cameron who had written back, and it was one incredible sense of relief. But if I had my chance, I would have done that. We talked about my dad coming and joining me on the journey, and that's unfortunately didn't come to pass. But my mum did come to the very end of the trip in Hungary, so that was a very special moment to see her there up on the podium as I took those final hoof steps.
Wow. Say those things while you can, folks. So these days you do a bunch of stuff. You until recently took groups on tour, trips to Mongolia, you write, you speak. You take groups of business executives out into the wilderness. What's that like? How do they react?
Well, I took a group. I'm sure they wouldn't mind me mentioning. I took a group from IKEA out into the wilderness not that long ago, and it was a wonderful experience because there was no mobile coverage, and they had a day off of the 3 days of conferencing. It was a day off, and we went up and went hiking through the bush, and we as you do when you're walking, you just fall into conversations with whoever happens to be beside you, and we were switching on, and yet this feeling that people were switching on more than they would be with so many distractions. And I kind of have come back firmly of the belief that in this kind of modern world, there's no substitute for going out and having a very sensory experience of the world, having an adventure. The meaning of discovery was never just about, you know, that kind of heroic image that we might have of exploration, which is about people going and planting flags on continents. It's never been just about that. For me, more importantly, it's about extending yourself to learn human wisdoms from different cultures and different people. And when you're out in the wilderness and running a conference in that setting, I feel that people connect on a whole different level, and that was really great to see. And hopefully there'll be more of that. But at the moment, of course, it's a very different reality. This is my first Australian winter in 17 years. I've been overseas on adventures every year since 2003, and normally at this time I'm taking groups on extended treks in the Altai Mountains of Western Mongolia. So this is the silver lining for me, is being able to spend time here and reflect on where I'm at and do all those kind of things that I never get a chance to usually.
Cool. We've got some quick questions from the viewers. Were you ever literally scared for your life out there?
Yeah, several times, particularly in the beginning. I mean, I was absolutely terrified of horses, and I'd been told that if you're not careful, these horses will turn your bones to dust. So I think the most dangerous thing I ever did each day was get up and get on those horses. I was terrified about slipping on the ice in the winter, breaking a leg, and having the horses bolt off, leaving me stranded. In those conditions, I just wouldn't have survived. That didn't come to pass, although there were several occasions when my horses did run off and I was left alone, and I'd spent half a day chasing them, searching for them. There were times when, there were wolves came very close to my camp in Mongolia. I got a fire going. I ended up carrying firecrackers to throw out the tent door at night to keep them at bay. And then, of course, there were the thieves. Bureaucracy was one of the most terrifying things. I was taken in many times by authorities and accused of being a spy, among other things. I was accused of being an illegal immigrant, a smuggler, a chamomile flower collector, a vodka trader, a cheese trader. Not many people would have first believed I was an Australian riding horses on the trail of Genghis Khan. But in all
you look like a cheese trader to me. Hey, we've got a ton of questions, so we'll just go really quick answers. Oh, brutal question for someone we know lives in Melbourne. Where are you hoping to travel to next? Is it the supermarket?
Well, I'm actually trying to just explore my own backyard a little bit more. My next destination will be the Snowy River in eastern Victoria. I've done a bit of scouting out there and some trips before. And to me, that's one place where it's not too far from Melbourne, but you can feel as if you're in another total other world. For those who haven't been there or live in Victoria or in Australia, it is an extraordinary place to visit. But apart from that, I'd love to travel from India to Europe on the trail of the Roma people, the Gypsies. So from where they originated in Rajasthan right through to Europe, where, of course, as we know, many Romani people live today.
Did you find, was the oral tradition and sharing stories alive and thriving in your travels? We saw photos of that.
Absolutely. And I felt when I came back, one of the things that motivated me to write the book, and it took me 4 years to write and research my book, was the incredible stories that these people had told me about. Their personal stories, their oral histories, the music, some of these sayings that we've learned about today. I felt that I could have written an entire tome just about my time in Kazakhstan, let alone the entire journey. And for me, I don't know for people who are watching, but that part of the world was a bit of a black hole in my geographical knowledge growing up. I knew nothing about it, and when you enter it and recognise how much history, how much culture, how much to learn, it's just extraordinary to know that there's so much there. You don't have to be the first. As much as you can see every inch of the planet these days on Google Earth, there is no substitute for going out and getting to know these people and cultures and histories, if that makes sense.
Speaking of history, here's a good question. How is Genghis Khan and his legacy seen in Mongolia today? They still wear Genghis t-shirts, man?
Well, absolutely. During the Soviet period, worship of Genghis Khan was essentially forbidden. It was kind of outlawed. Their history was rewritten. But since the 90s, there's been a real resurgence in celebration of Genghis Khan. Of course, particularly from the Mongols' point of view, and quite rightly, for someone who was the founder of the largest contiguous land empire that's ever been. It was a remarkable achievement. And one thing that struck me about Genghis Khan from the very beginning is that we often think of world leaders as being these aristocrats sitting in their castles. Here was a person who lived his life as a nomad on horseback in a yurt tent for the entirety of his life, right into his 70s. And if you were to take that empire today, that land area, half the world's population now lives there. So you get a sense of just of the scale of this place. And there's a lot more to meet the eye than the stories that we often have traditionally heard of conquest and destruction. And I mean, he's always going to be a friend or a foe, according to which side of on which side you happen to fall. But no, definitely these days there's Genghis Khan vodka. There's a great big statue of Genghis Khan in the middle of Ulaanbaatar, in front of Parliament. He's very widely admired. Yeah.
I would so be up to get a bottle of Genghis Khan vodka if I saw it down at the bottle. We have quite a few questions. We only time for one more. Out of the experiences and incredible people you met, what do you find yourself reflecting on the most?
I think I keep reflecting on how in my position on that journey, I was very, very vulnerable. Not only do I have myself to look after, but 3 horses. And when those horses were tired, I could not go a step further without feeding them, resting them. So I would often turn up in villages, for example, the middle of the Kazakh desert in the summer, helpless really. To survive and for my horses to survive, I needed the help and the knowledge and the refuge from people. And I didn't have that luxury that we often do in our life here to pick and choose my friends according to what I may have liked on the surface or about a person or not. I had to appeal to the better side of humans no matter who they were. And I feel like, for example, I remember a family who took me in at 8 o'clock in the morning just as the sun was coming up into their underground hut. They got their camels, they were milking their camels. They fed me a couple of litres of fresh camel milk. They took my horses down to water. What little extra feed they had for their animals, they offered it to mine. They fed my dog. They let me sleep. So I've been riding all night. And something I reflect on all the time is just how you've got to be careful in our environment not to miss the opportunity to get to know people who are different to you. I find myself now, it's so easy when you're independent to not go out of your way to get to know people who come from a different point of view, but from whom we can learn from. So that'd be the thing I reflect on, making friends with people who maybe you can't relate to.
I think that's an incredibly valuable lesson, and certainly for people in the business world, you do surround yourself with people who look, sound and think exactly the same way as you, and the more you can embrace people outside of that, the better your life will be. Look, Tim, that's been a fascinating conversation. Embrace strangers, do mad things, live a better life surrounded by less physical stuff, and Tell your parents you love them while you have the chance. A lot of really important stuff there. So really appreciate your time today, Tim. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in. This has been Saxton Scene Change Fireside Chats. See you next time. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much.